The snow fell softly on the ruins of Aachen in March 1945, muffling the sound of American boots on broken cobblestones. Sergeant Michael Brennan had seen many things in this war. He had stormed beaches, cleared bunkers, watched friends die in his arms. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter in a shattered German city on the edge of collapse. He was 23 years old, from a farm in Iowa. He had joined the army believing in simple truths: good versus evil, right versus wrong, freedom versus tyranny. The world had seemed clear then, painted in the stark colors of propaganda posters and newsreels. But war had a way of blurring those lines, of turning certainties into questions that gnawed at you in the long, cold nights. As his unit moved deeper into Germany that spring, Brennan began to see something that troubled him more than enemy fire. He saw hunger. Not the kind of hunger he'd known during the Depression, when meals were small and bellies grumbled. This was different. This was starvation, written on the faces of children who watched them from bombed-out windows, with eyes too large for their gaunt faces. The orders were clear. Fraternization with German civilians was strictly prohibited. No giving aid, no sharing rations, no personal interaction. The enemy was the enemy, even the children. Especially the children, some officers said, because they had been raised under Nazi indoctrination, taught to hate everything America stood for. But orders were easier to follow when you couldn't see the individual faces, when hunger was just a word in a report rather than a 6-year-old girl with matchstick arms reaching toward you from a doorway. March 17th, 1945. The date would stay with Brennan for the rest of his life. His squad had been tasked with securing a residential district on the outskirts of what had once been a prosperous neighborhood. Now it was a landscape of broken walls and collapsed roofs, of furniture spilled into streets and family photographs trampled into mud. They were checking buildings for holdout German soldiers when Brennan heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it beneath the crunch of his own footsteps. A whimper, a child's cry, quickly stifled as if the one making it knew that sound meant danger. He signaled to his squad to hold position and approached a partially collapsed apartment building. The front wall had been sheared away by artillery, exposing the interior like a doll's house. He could see a kitchen on the second floor, a bedroom with a bed still made, curtains that somehow remained hanging despite everything around them being destroyed. The sound came again. Brennan followed it to a basement entrance, half buried under rubble. He shouldered his rifle and descended into darkness, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. What he found would haunt his dreams forever. 15 children, ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 12 years old, huddled together in the corner of a flooded basement. Their clothes hung off skeletal frames. Their skin was translucent, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, too visible. Some were too weak to even raise their heads when his light found them. And standing in front of them, like a guardian too frail to actually protect anyone, was a boy. Maybe 10 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell through the starvation. He held a piece of broken pipe in his trembling hands, raised like a weapon, his eyes fierce despite the obvious terror. "Greg," the boy said, his voice cracking. "Go away, Greg. Please, go away." Brennan stood there, frozen. His training screamed at him. Protocol, orders, don't engage. These were German children, the enemy's children. In a few years, they could be the ones shooting at American soldiers. That's what they'd been told. That's what they were supposed to believe. But all he could see was the boy with the pipe, shaking so hard he could barely stand, trying to protect children who looked like they hadn't eaten in weeks. Maybe months. Behind him, he heard Corporal Danny Martinez descending into the basement. Martinez was from Los Angeles, the son of Mexican immigrants, a man who'd faced his own share of prejudice before the war. He'd earned his stripes through sheer courage and had saved Brennan's life twice. When Martinez saw the children, he whispered one word: Jesus. The boy with the pipe tensed, raising his pathetic weapon higher. His arms shook with the effort. Easy, Brennan said softly, though he knew the boy couldn't understand English. He slowly lowered his rifle, holding up one hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. With his other hand, he reached into his pack and pulled out a Karashian chocolate bar. He'd been saving it, a little luxury in a world of deprivation. He'd planned to eat it that night, a small comfort after another day of death and destruction. But now, looking at those hollow faces, the chocolate felt like a betrayal in his hands. How could he have been carrying food while children starved meters away? Brennan took a slow step forward. The boy raised the pipe higher, but Brennan could see the desperation in his eyes now. Could see the way he glanced back at the other children, calculating odds he was too young to have to calculate. "It's okay," Brennan murmured, knowing his tone mattered more than his words. "It's okay, kid. We're not gonna hurt you." He set the chocolate bar on the ground and stepped back. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was water dripping somewhere in the darkness and the shallow breathing of malnourished children. Then one of the younger ones, a girl with blonde braids matted with dirt, made a small sound, a whimper of desperate need. The boy with the pipe glanced back at her, and in that moment, Brennan saw him make a decision. Saw him choose to trust, or at least choose to hope, because hope was all he had left. The boy lowered the pipe slowly. He crept forward, eyes never leaving Brennan, and snatched up the chocolate bar. He retreated quickly, unwrapping it with shaking fingers, and broke it into pieces. 15 pieces for 15 children. Each piece so small it would barely register on the tongue, but the children took them like they were receiving communion, like they were holy. Martinez swore softly behind Brennan. "Sarge," he said, his voice tight, "what do we do?" It was the question Brennan had been asking himself since he'd seen those faces. What do you do when your orders conflict with your conscience? What do you do when the enemy stops looking like the enemy and starts looking like victims? What do you do when you're 23 years old and you hold power over life and death, and you're not sure you're wise enough to wield it? "Go back up," Brennan said quietly. "Tell the lieutenant we're still clearing the building. Buy me some time." "Brennan, that's an order, Corporal." Martinez hesitated, then nodded. His footsteps echoed up the stairs, leaving Brennan alone with the children. He unslung his pack and started pulling out rations. Everything he had. Everything he'd been carrying. The children watched him with expressions that tore at something deep in his chest. Hope and fear mixed together in equal measure. The boy with the pipe spoke again. "Where why?" Brennan didn't speak German, but he understood the question. Why would an enemy soldier feed them? Why would one of the men who had bombed their city, who had killed their fathers and brothers, show them kindness? He wished he had an answer that made sense. He wished he could explain that war was more complicated than they'd told him, that humanity didn't stop at national borders, that seeing a starving child made him think of his little sister back home and how he'd feel if she was the one huddling in a basement, terrified and alone. Instead, he just said one word he'd learned from a German prisoner: kinder. Children. The boy stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if that was explanation enough. As if, despite everything they'd been taught, despite all the propaganda about American monsters, he could recognize simple human decency when he saw it. Brennan distributed the rations as carefully as he could, trying to remember the medic's warnings about refeeding starving people too quickly. The children grabbed at the food with desperate hands, but the boy with the pipe, who seemed to be the oldest, stopped them with sharp words in German. He rationed it out himself, making sure the smallest ones got portions first, holding back the hands of those who tried to take more than their share. Watching him, Brennan realized this child had been acting as a parent, had been keeping these other children alive through means he could only imagine. The thought made him feel sick and humbled at the same time. Martinez returned a few minutes later with Private James Cooper, a lanky kid from Tennessee who'd been a medic before they'd needed him to carry a rifle. Cooper took one look at the children and his jaw tightened. He didn't say anything about orders or regulations. He just knelt down and started examining them with professional efficiencies, checking pulses, looking at their eyes, assessing damage that went beyond what any child should endure. Malnutrition, Cooper said quietly. Severe. Some of them have infections. This little one, he gestured to a boy who couldn't have been more than 5, I think he has pneumonia. They needed help a week ago, maybe 2. Can we help them now? Brennan asked. Cooper met his eyes. We have medicine. We have food. But Sarge, you know what'll happen if the brass finds out. Fraternization with enemy civilians is a court-martial offense. They've made examples of guys for less. I know. So what are we doing here? Brennan looked at the children again. The little girl with the blonde braids had fallen asleep sitting up, her head resting against the older boy's shoulder. The chocolate smeared on her face made her look even younger, even more innocent. She couldn't have understood what Hitler was, what the Nazis had done. She'd just been born into a nightmare, not of her making. We're being human beings, Brennan said. Just for today. Just for right now. Cooper nodded slowly. Martinez said nothing, but he started pulling out his own rations, and that was agreement enough. For the next hour, they worked in that basement. They gave the children water, carefully controlled amounts so they wouldn't get sick. Cooper treated the worst of the infections with sulfur powder from his medical kit. They found blankets in the ruined apartments above and brought them down, wrapping the shivering children against the cold. The older boy watched everything with wary eyes, never quite relaxing, never quite trusting. Through gestures and broken phrases, they learned his name was Dieter. He'd been watching over these children since the bombing raids had killed their parents, or sent their parents fleeing, or separated them in the chaos of a city coming apart. Some of the children were siblings, others were neighbors. One little boy, perhaps 6 years old, simply didn't speak at all. He just stared at nothing, his eyes empty in a way that spoke of things witnessed that no child should see. Dieter stayed close to him, occasionally touching his shoulder as if to remind him he wasn't alone. Where are their parents? Martinez asked, though he knew Brennan didn't have an answer. Dead. Fled. Who knows? Brennan rubbed his face. The city's been under siege for months. Civilians have been caught in the crossfire. They're German civilians, Martinez said, but there was no conviction in his voice. We're supposed to remember that. You remember that when you look at her? Brennan pointed at the sleeping girl. Because I can't. Martinez was quiet for a moment. My little sister is about her age, Rosa, back in Los Angeles. He smiled sadly. She loves chocolate too. They heard footsteps on the stairs. All 3 soldiers tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but it was just Corporal Eddie Walsh, the squad's radio man. Walsh had been in the army since before Pearl Harbor, had seen action in North Africa and Italy before they'd shipped him to Europe. He had a wife and 2 daughters back in Boston that he talked about constantly. He looked at the children, and his weathered face went soft. "Lieutenant's asking about the delay," Walsh said. "I told him we found a collapsed section and are working to clear it safely. He bought it, for now." "Thanks, Eddie." Walsh knelt down and looked at Diety. "Hey, kid," he said gently. He pulled out a photograph from his wallet, creased and worn from being carried across 3 continents. 2 little girls with dark curls smiled at the camera. "My daughters, Maggie and Anne." Dieter looked at the photograph, then up at Walsh. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that these American soldiers were fathers, brothers, sons, that they had families too, that they were more than just uniforms and rifles. Slowly, carefully, Dieter reached into his pocket and pulled out his own photograph. It was crumpled and water-stained, but you could still make out the image. A family. Mother, father, older brother, and Dieter, probably 2 years younger in the picture, smiling in front of a house that no longer existed. "Family," Dieter said quietly. "Family," Walsh echoed. He looked at Brennan. "Sarge, we can't just leave them here." "I know, so what's the plan?" Brennan had been asking himself that question since he'd descended into this basement. The military government would be setting up displaced persons camps, places for refugees and orphaned children. But those camps were weeks away from being organized in this sector. By then, these children might be dead. Even if they survived, the bureaucracy of war would grind slowly, and children fell through cracks in bureaucracies. "There's a church," Martinez said suddenly, 3 blocks east. "We passed it on patrol yesterday. Still standing mostly. Saw a nun there, maybe a priest. Looked like they were sheltering civilians. It was a risk, moving the children through a city that was still technically a combat zone. And if anyone saw them, if word got back to command about American soldiers aiding German civilians, they'd face serious consequences. But leaving them here was effectively a death sentence. "We move them after dark," Brennan decided. "Tell the lieutenant we're bedding down in this sector for the night. Rotation watch. Walsh, you draw up a route that keeps us off the main streets. Martinez, scout ahead and make sure that church is still viable. Cooper, you stay here with me and the kids. Keep them stable until we can move." His squad didn't question the orders. They should have. Any of them could have reported him, could have refused to participate in what was clearly a violation of military protocol. But they didn't. Maybe because they were tired of war and death and doing nothing while people suffered. Maybe because they had children of their own back home, or siblings, or just memories of what it felt like to be young and scared. Or maybe because some things transcended orders. Some things mattered more than regulations written by men who'd never looked into a starving child's eyes. As his men dispersed to their tasks, Brennan sat down on the damp basement floor. Dieter watched him carefully, still protective of his charges, still ready to fight with a piece of pipe if needed. But he sat down too, accepting for now that these Americans weren't a threat. "You're a good kid," Brennan said quietly. "Brave. Your parents would be proud." Dieter didn't understand the words, but maybe he understood the tone. Comday. He looked down at the photograph in his hands, at the family that no longer existed, and his shoulders began to shake. No sound, just silent sobs that racked his too thin frame. Brennan wanted to reach out, to comfort him somehow, but he didn't know if that would be welcome. Didn't know if he had the right, as one of the invaders who had destroyed this child's world. So he just sat there, bearing witness to grief he could never fully understand. Meme, one of the younger children, a girl about 8 with dark hair, crawled over to Dieter and wrapped her arms around him. Then another child joined, and another, until Dieter was surrounded by the very children he'd been protecting. They held him while he cried, and Brennan had to look away because the intimacy of it felt like something he shouldn't intrude upon. Cooper returned with more supplies he'd scrounged from other squad members. Word was apparently spreading quietly through the unit about the children in the basement. Soldiers who should have been following orders instead were donating rations, offering blankets, contributing what little they had to help. Johnson heard about it, Cooper said, the private from Alabama. You know what he said? What? He said his farm got hit by a tornado when he was 12, killed his baby brother. He said the neighbors came, even though it was the Depression and nobody had anything to spare. They came because that's what people do. They help. Cooper smiled sadly. Then he gave me his entire week's ration of chocolate. Brennan felt something tight in his chest, loosened slightly. They were all so young, all of them. Children themselves in many ways, barely out of their teens, asked to do impossible things in an impossible situation. And somehow, despite everything, despite the propaganda and the fear and the hatred, they were choosing kindness. Night fell over the ruins of Akan like a curtain dropping on a tragic play. The darkness was nearly absolute. The city's electricity had been destroyed weeks ago, and no one dared light fires that might draw attention. Brennan waited in the basement with the children, listening to the sounds of the dying city above, distant artillery, the occasional burst of small arms fire. Somewhere, a dog howling. Cooper had managed to get some thin soup into most of the children, warming it over a small chemical heater that gave off almost no light. They ate slowly, carefully, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle much. The little boy who didn't speak had taken his portion and retreated to a corner, eating alone, his eyes still empty. "What's his name?" Brennan asked Dieter, pointing at the silent child. Dieter's face clouded. "Carl. His family." He made a gesture, an explosion with his hands, and the meaning was clear enough. Carl had seen his family die, had perhaps been buried in rubble with their bodies. Some things broke children in ways that couldn't be easily fixed. Martinez returned just after 8 o'clock, materializing out of the darkness like a ghost. "Church is clear. The nun I saw, her name is Sister Agnes, Austrian, not German. She's been sheltering about 20 civilians, mostly women and elderly. She says she'll take the children. She knows there'll be extra mouths to feed. She knows." Said something about how God would provide. Martinez shrugged. She seemed pretty convinced about it. Route? Mapped it out. Mostly back alleys and bombed buildings. Should keep us off the main patrol paths. But Sarge, there's something else. Brennan tensed. What? Lieutenant Hendricks is asking questions about why we've been holding up in this sector for so long. Walsh has been feeding him excuses, but I don't think he's buying it anymore. We need to move soon. Lieutenant Hendricks was a by-the-book officer from West Point, the kind of man who saw regulations as sacred texts. If he discovered what they were doing, he'd throw them all in the stockade without hesitation. Brennan had seen him dress down a soldier for sharing a cigarette with a German POW. "We move in 30 minutes, Brennan decided. Full darkness. "Walsh, you take point with the radio. Martinez, rear guard. Cooper and I will move with the children. What about weapons? Cooper asked. It was a good question. They'd be moving through unsecured territory with limited visibility. They needed to be ready for contact. But they'd also be escorting 15 malnourished children who could barely walk. Weapons and children made an uncomfortable combination. Keep your sidearms, Brennan said, rifles slung. If we run into trouble, the priority's getting these kids to safety, not engaging the enemy. His men nodded and began preparing. Brennan turned to Dieter, trying to figure out how to communicate the plan. He pointed up, then made walking motions with his fingers. Dieter frowned, then understanding dawned. He began speaking rapidly to the other children in German, explaining what was about to happen. Some of the younger ones looked frightened. They'd been in this basement for weeks, maybe months. It had become their world, however terrible. The unknown was terrifying, even when the known was barely survivable. Dieter knelt down and spoke to each child individually, his voice gentle and reassuring. Brennan couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone who had learned to be brave when he had every right to be terrified. Someone who had stepped into a role he was too young for because there was no one else to fill it. When it was time to move, they organized the children as best they could. The stronger ones would walk on their own. The weaker ones would be carried. Cooper fashioned a rough stretcher out of blankets and tent poles for the boy with pneumonia, who had developed a fever and could barely stay conscious. Brennan lifted the little blonde girl onto his back. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and tattered clothes. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he could feel her heart beating against his shoulder blades, fast and frightened like a bird's. "It's okay," he murmured. "I've got you." They ascended from the basement into a world that looked like the end of everything. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, illuminating the skeletal remains of what had once been someone's home. Photographs lay scattered on the floor, faces smiling up from broken glass. A child's toy, a wooden horse, sat incongruously on a pile of bricks. The detritus of normal life shattered. Walsh led them into the street, moving slowly, checking corners with practiced caution. The city felt abandoned, but Brennan knew that was an illusion. There were still German soldiers holding out in pockets throughout the urban area. There were desperate civilians who might see American soldiers and panic. There were 1,000 ways this could go wrong. The little girl on his back tightened her grip as they moved through the darkness. He could feel her trembling, could hear her whispering something in German. A prayer maybe, or just a child's litany of fear. They made it 2 blocks without incident, moving through the ruins like ghosts. The children were remarkably quiet, understanding instinctively that silence meant survival. Even the youngest ones, who should have been crying, who should have been allowed to be children, moved with the grim determination of those who had learnt that tears accomplish nothing. On the 3rd block, Walsh raised his fist, the signal to halt. Everyone froze, in the silence. Brennan heard what had caught Walsh's attention. Voices, German voices, coming from a building to their right. He carefully lowered the little girl to the ground, putting a finger to his lips. She nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. Dieter gathered the other children into a tight group, keeping them calm with whispered words and gentle hands. Brennan crept forward to where Walsh was pressed against a wall. Through a broken window, they could see 4 German soldiers sitting round a small fire. Wehrmacht, not SS. Regular army. They looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, their uniforms ragged. One of them was bandaged, dark stains suggesting the wound beneath was infected. Another couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Just kids, Walsh breathed. Like us. They were the enemy. Brennan knew that. These were men who had fought for Hitler, who had enabled the Nazi war machine, who had participated in atrocities across Europe. Orders were to engage on sight, to eliminate any German military presence. But they were also just 4 exhausted soldiers who looked like they'd given up on the war, who were probably waiting to surrender to someone who wouldn't shoot them on sight. And engaging them would mean gunfire, would mean noise, would mean drawing attention to 15 children who couldn't afford to be noticed. We go around, Brennan decided. Walsh looked relieved. They backtracked half a block and took a different route, adding 10 minutes to their journey, but avoiding contact. As they moved away, Brennan heard one of the German soldiers laugh at something, a brief moment of levity in the darkness. It sounded exactly like the way Cooper laughed, exactly like the way any young man might laugh when trying to forget the horror surrounding him. The realization troubled Brennan more than he wanted to admit. It was easier when the enemy was faceless, when you could think of them as monsters rather than as scared teenagers sitting round a fire, waiting for a war to end that they no longer believed in. They pressed on through the ruined city, past buildings that leaned at impossible angles, their structural integrity destroyed, but somehow still standing. Past craters filled with water that reflected the moon like dark mirrors. Past the burned-out hulk of what had once been a school. Its playground equipment twisted into abstract sculptures by fire and explosion. The little girl on Brennan's back had stopped trembling. He thought maybe she'd fallen asleep, exhausted by fear and malnutrition and the simple effort of staying alive. Her breath was warm against his neck, and he found himself adjusting his grip carefully, trying not to wake her, trying to give her a few moments of peace. Martinez appeared beside him, moving silently. 2 more blocks, he whispered. But there's a problem. What problem? There's a checkpoint, American checkpoint. Looks like they set it up while we were in the basement. 2 MPs and a sergeant. Right on our route to the church. Brennan swore under his breath. MPs meant military police, meant men whose job was specifically to enforce regulations. Men who would absolutely report soldiers fraternizing with German civilians. Men who would see what they were doing and stop it immediately. He wasn't alone. Despite the non-fraternization orders, despite the very real anger they felt toward Germany, soldiers across the occupation zone were quietly sharing their rations with starving civilians. They'd slip food through fences, leave packages where children would find them, look the other way when desperate mothers scavenged through their garbage. Some did it out of simple human compassion. Others did it because it reminded them of their own families. And some did it precisely because it was so difficult. Because showing mercy to those who didn't deserve it felt like reclaiming their own humanity in the face of so much inhumanity. But this mercy came with a cost. The displaced persons in the camps, the survivors of the Holocaust, watched as American soldiers gave food to German children while they themselves were still struggling to survive. It was a betrayal that cut deep. One survivor later wrote, "We had been starved for years by these people, and now we watched American soldiers, our liberators, feeding them. It felt like our suffering meant nothing." The moral complexity was staggering. There were no good choices, only terrible ones. Sergeant David Klein was a Jewish soldier from Chicago. He'd been one of the first Americans into Buchenwald. What he'd seen there had broken something inside him. For weeks afterward he couldn't eat, couldn't sleep without seeing those images. the bodies stacked like cordwood, the living prisoners who looked like walking corpses, the children, God, the children in those camps. He'd sworn he would never show kindness to a German. Never. They were all guilty, every single one of them. But then came the day in a small town, whose name he never learnt. His unit was moving through, just passing through, when he saw something that stopped him cold. A woman, clearly dying, lying in the rubble of what had been her home. And next to her 3 small children, crying, trying to wake her up. David kept walking. Not his problem, not his concern. These were German children, enemy children. But he made it maybe 50 feet before he stopped, before he turned around, before he went back. The woman was beyond help. She died while he was checking her pulse, but the children could be saved. David carried those 3 kids to a displaced persons camp. He found someone who could care for them. He used his own rations to feed them, and the whole time he was crying. Crying for those kids. Crying for the children in Borkenwald who'd had no one to save them. Crying because doing the right thing felt so wrong, and doing the wrong thing felt impossible. Years later, he would say that moment changed him forever. That carrying those German children to safety, while the ghosts of Jewish children haunted his memory, was the hardest thing he ever did. Harder than combat, harder than Buchenwald, because in that moment he had to choose between justice and mercy, and he chose mercy, and he still wasn't sure if he'd been right. The truth is, there was no right answer. The moral equation of post-war Germany was unsolvable. How do you balance collective guilt with individual innocence? How do you punish a nation without punishing its children? How do you show mercy without dishonoring the victims? The American soldiers who fed starving German children in 1945 weren't heroes, but they weren't villains either. They were just young men, far from home, trying to hold on to their humanity in the aftermath of humanity's greatest crime. Some were punished for violating the non-fraternization orders. Others were quietly praised. Most simply did what they felt they had to do, and carried the moral weight of it for the rest of their lives. By the end of 1945, policies began to change. The reality of mass starvation couldn't be ignored. Relief programs were implemented. The Marshall Plan would eventually help rebuild Germany. The children who survived that terrible spring would grow up to create a new Germany, a democratic Germany, a Germany that would confront its past rather than deny it. But in that moment, in the spring of 1945, none of that was certain. There was only the choice each soldier had to make: to walk past the starving child, or to stop, to obey orders, or to follow conscience, to see the enemy, or to see a human being. Jimmy Thompson, the soldier from the beginning of our story, made his choice. He took out his ration. He walked over to that little girl eating garbage. He gave her his food. She looked at him with those huge eyes, terrified and hopeful at the same time. She whispered, "Dunker, thank you." Jimmy never forgot her. For the rest of his life he wondered what happened to her, whether she survived, whether she grew up, whether she ever knew that the American soldier who fed her that day had struggled with the decision, that it had cost him something to show her that mercy. The story of what happened when American soldiers met starving German children in 1945 is a story without a clean ending. It's a story about the impossible choices that follow war, about how victory doesn't erase moral complexity, it deepens it, about how the hardest battles are sometimes the ones we fight within ourselves. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, even in the aftermath of unimaginable evil, we still have to choose who we want to be. And sometimes, the most important choice is to see the humanity in those we've been taught to hate, not because they deserve it, but because we do.